I have lost the company, the house, and the last dollar in my name. Whoever wants to leave can grab a suitcase right now." The folder hit the table hard enough to rattle the crystal glasses on the sideboard. Nathaniel Harrington stood in the middle of his living room, his face pale, his tie loosened, while the phones on the coffee table kept flashing the same headline, "Harrington Design on the brink of collapse." Outside, a tow truck pulled away with the last of his sports cars, and two men were sealing the door of his home office with yellow tape. Vanessa Cole pressed a hand to her mouth, feigning a worry that never reached her eyes. Clare Harrington, on the other hand, wasn't looking at the windows or the paintings or the jewelry scattered across the room. She was looking only at her husband. Nathaniel slid a fake foreclosure notice across the table and said the accounts were frozen. The company had no cash left, and the house was about to be seized. Then, from upstairs, came the unmistakable sound of a zipper closing. For a few seconds, nobody breathed. Nathaniel turned toward the staircase with a bitter kind of satisfaction, certain that Clare had run to the bedroom to pack. That was the answer he'd been chasing for weeks, the proof that would confirm every suspicion, the proof that love always came with a price tag. But the woman who appeared on the landing wasn't his wife. Vanessa came down the stairs with an ivory suitcase, a coat over one arm, her purse clutched to her chest. She wouldn't look at Clare and turned to Nathaniel with a voice cracked just a little too perfectly. Her mother had taken ill, she said. She had to leave immediately. She couldn't afford to be caught up in a financial investigation. Before she walked out, she slid off the diamond bracelet he'd given her in secret and set it on the entry table like a hotel key being returned. The door shut and the sound rolled through the house like a verdict. Nathaniel didn't know what to say. He had braced for tears, for accusations, maybe even a goodbye from Clare. But never this. Never Vanessa bolting, the woman who for months had sworn she'd stand by him, even if the whole world turned against him. Clare watched the suitcase vanish behind the glass, then bent down and picked up a page that had slipped from the folder. She didn't ask how much money was left, or whether they'd keep the house, or what would happen to the trip they'd planned to the Outer Banks. She asked how many employees hadn't been paid, and how many families depended on the factory staying open. Nathaniel told her maybe more than 400 people were about to lose their jobs. Clare pressed her lips together, reached up, unclipped her earrings and set them down beside the bracelet Vanessa had left behind. "Then let's start by selling these," she said. That single gesture robbed Nathaniel of the victory he'd been so sure was coming. Clare wasn't proving she loved him. She was refusing to abandon people she'd never even met. If this story already has you hooked, hit subscribe and stay with us to find out exactly how much a lie can cost when it's used to measure love. Because the first suitcase had revealed a coward's true colors, but the one still waiting in Clare's closet would end up saying something far more painful. To understand how Nathaniel arrived at that living room, staging his own ruin in front of the two women in his life, you have to go back 3 weeks. 3 weeks earlier, the headquarters of Harrington Design sat on Chicago's Michigan Avenue like a monument to certainty, all glass and polished steel, 11 floors that Nathaniel had built up from his grandfather's old furniture workshops in Rockford into a name that showed up in design magazines from coast to coast. He was 32 years old, and the trade press had just called him the most promising young executive in the Midwest, the kind of profile that came with a photo shoot on the rooftop terrace and a headline about legacy and reinvention. But behind the glass of his corner office, Nathaniel didn't feel invincible at all. He'd spent that morning scrolling through photos from a charity gala the night before, and in every single one, Clare was talking to the catering staff, the valets, the coat check attendant, never once posing beside the donors who'd written the big checks, never once angling for the photographer's attention the way half the room had. To anyone else, that would have read as warmth, as the kind of person who made everyone in a room feel seen regardless of what they could offer her. To him, raised on years of quiet suspicion, it read as a puzzle he couldn't solve, a woman who seemed to genuinely prefer the company of people who had nothing to offer her, and some part of him couldn't accept that at face value, couldn't quite believe kindness didn't come with an invoice attached somewhere down the line. His father had died in a hospital bed on the North Shore, telling him that nobody got close to a Harrington without calculating what they could get out of it first, that the name alone was a magnet for people who wanted a piece of it, that the day he stopped watching for the angle was the day someone finally found it. Nathaniel had sworn he'd never let that bitterness define him, and then had spent his whole adult life turning it into a compass anyway, checking every kindness for a hidden angle, even the kindness of the woman who'd married him back when he still drove a used Honda and worked out of a converted garage in Evanston. Vanessa Cole understood that wound better than anyone alive, better even than Nathaniel understood it himself, because she'd spent 2 years studying exactly where it sat and exactly how hard to press. As the company's communications director, she spent more hours in his orbit than anyone on the board, more hours than his own wife most weeks. Flights, late dinners with clients, the kind of proximity that builds its own gravity whether either person means it to or not. She walked into his office that afternoon with a folder of old clippings and set it on his desk without a word, letting the silence do some of the work for her. Inside was an interview Clare had given to a local paper before the wedding, back when she was still working as a bookkeeper in Cleveland, where she'd admitted, laughing, that she never imagined herself living in a house with a wine cellar, that she'd grown up in a 2-bedroom rental off West 25th Street and thought a nice apartment with in-unit laundry was the ceiling of what she'd ever have. Vanessa read the line aloud in a voice that made it sound almost damning. "Some people adapt to money awfully fast," she said, closing the folder, letting the comment hang there like smoke in a closed room. Then, almost in passing, like it barely mattered at all, "Did you know she's been asking about property values out in Cleveland? Nothing wrong with that, I'm sure. Just interesting timing, don't you think, with everything going on at the plant?" Nathaniel wanted to defend his wife right there, wanted to say Clare wasn't like that, had never once asked him for anything she didn't strictly need, had in fact turned down a bigger engagement ring twice, before he finally talked her into the one she wore now. The words stuck in his throat instead. He had no idea Clare was looking into that building, because she wanted to turn it into transitional housing for women leaving abusive situations. She'd found the listing through a legal aid group downtown and had already emailed a property manager about a walkthrough, all of it funded quietly out of an account with her own name on it, nobody else's. Vanessa knew, because she'd intercepted the email routing through the company's shared server months earlier, when she'd first started watching Clare's activity out of simple jealousy that eventually curdled into something more calculated, but she left that part out on purpose. It didn't serve her. That evening, Nathaniel got home earlier than usual and found Clare in the kitchen with Dorothy Klein, a housekeeper who'd just been let go by the cleaning contractor that served 3 of the Harrington properties after the contractor lost a bid on renewal. Clare was sitting across from her at the kitchen island, laptop open, helping her fill out unemployment paperwork line by line, patient as a tutor, stopping every few minutes to make sure Dorothy actually understood each section instead of just clicking through it. She'd already called Diane Foster, head of HR at Harrington Design, to ask whether there was an opening on the facilities team, and had left Dorothy's number written on a sticky note stuck to the fridge as a reminder to follow up herself if Diane hadn't called back by Friday. Nathaniel heard the words, watched his wife's hand resting on the older woman's shoulder, and still his mind stayed snagged on Vanessa's insinuation from that afternoon, replaying it on a loop underneath everything he was supposed to be paying attention to. He read the whole scene as a performance, generosity staged for an audience of one household employee who might mention it to the others, who might carry the story back to whoever Clare actually wanted hearing it. When Dorothy left with a hug and a promise to call, he asked too casually, leaning against the counter, about the Cleveland property. Clare said it was too early to talk about it, that she wanted to be sure she could fund it entirely herself, out of the savings she'd kept separate since before the marriage on principle, so no one could ever say she'd used his money to build her own reputation or her own escape hatch. Her caution, born purely of prudence and maybe a little pride, landed on him as secrecy, one more locked door in a house he thought he knew every room of. That night they ate dinner across from each other under a chandelier, too grand for the distance already opening up between them, the housekeeper gone. The kitchen quiet in a way it usually wasn't. Clare brought up the Dayton, Ohio plant, where 3 separate employees had reached out to her directly, through a comment card program nobody in leadership actually read, about back-to-back double shifts with no overtime showing up on their pay stubs, and she suggested they drive down together unannounced, no PR team trailing behind them, no press release waiting to be issued afterward. Nathaniel, exhausted and defensive after a day spent fending off Vanessa's insinuations in his own head, asked, sharper than he meant to, if she suddenly wanted to run the company too. She said no, calmly, setting her fork down without a trace of anger in the gesture. She only wanted to know how the people holding up the Harrington name with their own two hands were actually being treated when nobody with a title was watching them. It should have moved him. Instead, he heard a challenge to his authority, one more data point in a case he was building, without even admitting to himself that he was building it at all, brick by brick, late at night, alone. After Clare went up to bed, Nathaniel sat alone by the fireplace with an untouched glass of scotch and opened a text that had just come through from Vanessa. Women who love the man stay when he loses his power. Women who love his name start planning their exit before he even knows it's coming. Which one do you think you married? He read it 3 times, staring at the screen until the words stopped meaning anything and started just sitting there, ugly and simple. A little after 11, he called Gregory Sullivan. Greg showed up at the house just before midnight, still in the suit he'd worn to a client dinner downtown, tie stuffed loose in his jacket pocket, looking like a man who'd been called away from something he'd rather have finished. He was the company's chief financial officer, one of the few people on earth who could tell Nathaniel an idea was reckless and actually mean it. Though that night, standing in the study with the door closed, it took him several long minutes to find the nerve to say so out loud. Nathaniel laid it out plainly, pacing behind his desk like a man rehearsing a pitch. Freeze certain personal and business accounts, quietly move the cars to a shell entity registered under a cousin's name in Wisconsin, suspend a couple of Clare's cards, and leak word of an imminent collapse to 2 reporters he trusted to run with it fast, and without asking too many follow-up questions. He wasn't trying to hurt the business, he insisted. He just wanted to see once and for all who stayed when the money seemed to vanish. Greg asked very carefully, choosing each word, whether Clare knew she was being tested. Nathaniel said a test people saw coming wasn't a test at all. It was theater, and he needed the real thing, needed to know without any doubt whatsoever. Nate, that's not a test, Greg said, setting his glass down untouched on the edge of the desk. That's a trap. And you're not just setting it for her. You're setting it for 400 people who never asked to be collateral in your marriage. Nathaniel waved him off, pulled rank the way he rarely did with Greg, the two of them having built the company together from a garage and a single line of credit, promised the whole thing would run 10 days tops, and demanded absolute discretion. Not even Diane could know, not even the board's executive committee. Greg agreed, against every instinct telling him not to, mostly because 15 years of loyalty made it hard to say no to the man's face, and the unease never once left his own expression for the rest of that conversation. The plan started small, almost invisible, exactly the way Nathaniel had insisted it should. Clare's card got declined at a bookstore downtown on Wabash, and she just laughed it off with the cashier, apologized, and paid cash from her wallet without a flicker of alarm. The driver, a man named Curtis who'd worked for the family for 9 years, mentioned offhand over coffee one morning that one of the cars had been sold to cover a shortfall in the operating account. The property manager sent a memo saying they needed to trim the household budget for the quarter, effective immediately. Nathaniel expected panic, expected Clare to come to him with questions, maybe even fear tightening her voice. Instead, she cancelled a black-tie benefit dinner for the lyric opera she'd been looking forward to for weeks, started taking the L downtown instead of calling a car service, and asked the cook not to waste a single thing in the kitchen, teaching herself to stretch a Sunday roast into 3 separate meals the way her own mother used to. When her card failed a second time, at a pharmacy of all places, in front of a line of people behind her, she called the bank only to make sure it wasn't fraud, thanked the representative, and hung up without a hint of embarrassment. Then she asked Nathaniel directly, sitting on the edge of the bed that night, if they were going through something hard, and if he needed her to put her own savings into the business, no conditions, no questions asked beyond the necessary ones. He answered with evasions, watching her face the whole time like a judge weighing a verdict he'd already decided in advance and was simply waiting for the evidence to catch up to. That same afternoon, Vanessa showed up at the office with 2 glossy real estate catalogs for condos in Miami's Brickell neighborhood and asked, half joking, leaning close over his desk, whether it made sense to transfer certain gifts into her name before things got messy. Just to be safe. You understand? Nathaniel felt the first real jolt of doubt about her, a flicker he pushed down almost as fast as it rose, telling himself he was reading too much into an offhand comment. Vanessa caught the flicker anyway and pivoted, fast and smooth, insisting she only wanted to protect assets that could help them both later. Then wrapped him in a hug and swore, her voice low against his ear, that she would never leave him. Not for anything. Not for anyone. He wanted to believe her, because admitting otherwise meant admitting he'd mistaken hunger for loyalty, and that was a mistake his pride couldn't yet afford to sit with. Meanwhile, Claire drove out to the Dayton plant with Diane riding shotgun. No cameras, no press release, just the 2 of them, a legal pad, and a thermos of coffee for the 2-hour drive down I-75. She sat down with a seamstress named Angela Martinez in the break room, on a folding chair that wobbled a little, and listened, really listened, as Angela explained that over time pay hadn't come through in 2 months, and that 3 of her co-workers were already behind on rent because of it, one of them sleeping in her car for a stretch, rather than tell anyone. Claire talked to a machinist named Walter Briggs, who admitted, voice dropping so the supervisor 2 stations over wouldn't hear, that he was afraid to report a frayed safety guard on the line for fear of being marked as a troublemaker and quietly cut in the next round of scheduling. Claire took notes on everything in her own handwriting, photographed the paperwork Angela slid across the table when nobody else was looking, and promised she'd bring it all back to Nathaniel personally, no filters, no summary, written by someone else first. Diane, walking her out to the car afterward, mentioned that finance had frozen several budget lines without any explanation sent down the chain of command, a detail that lined up, though Claire didn't know it yet, with everything shifting at home over the past week. She assumed, the whole drive back to Chicago with the radio low and the sun going down over the interstate, that her husband was quietly hiding a real financial crisis to spare her the worry of it, and the thought made her love him a little more fiercely, not less, made her grip the wheel a little tighter with something like resolve. Back at the house, she found Nathaniel by the fireplace, sorting through emails on his laptop, the glow of the screen the only light in the room. She handed him her notes from the plant, page after page in her neat handwriting, and asked him to put payroll ahead of any client entertaining budget for the quarter, no exceptions. He told her, flatly, not looking up, that they might have to lay people off soon. She went quiet, breathed once deep, set the folder down on the arm of the chair, and asked how much time they had left before that decision had to be made. He said he couldn't give her numbers yet. She reminded him gently, sitting down across from him now, that she'd worked as a bookkeeper for 6 years before they married, that she knew how to read a budget line by line, that she wanted to help carry this instead of just being told about it after the fact. He turned her down flat, terrified that giving her real access would expose the whole simulation in a single afternoon of her going through the actual books. The refusal landed like contempt across the room, and she felt it land. "I don't need you to protect me from the truth," she said, and for the first time in the conversation her voice cracked just slightly. "I need you to let me carry it with you." Nathaniel looked away, toward the fire, and for one long second he actually thought about calling Greg right then and ending the whole thing, until his phone buzzed on the side table with another message from Vanessa, inviting him to a private dinner the next night. And the thought slipped away as easily as it had come, like something he'd already decided not to hold on to. At that dinner, in a private room at a hotel just off the river, with a view of the skyline lighting up one building at a time, Vanessa turned Nathaniel's fear into something close to intimate theater, pouring the wine herself, taking her time. She told him, leaning across the white tablecloth, that Claire had spent years perfecting an image of humility, precisely because it made her untouchable in public, because nobody questions the billionaire's wife who rides the train and shops second-hand and volunteers at the shelter twice a month. "It's the perfect cover," she said, "the kind no one thinks to look past. No woman," she went on, "willingly gives up a mansion, first-class travel, and a name like Harrington. Not really, not all at once, not without something waiting on the other side of the door." Then she floated it, almost gently, like she was doing him a favor, like this was simply the logical next step. Announce the bankruptcy in front of both of them at the same time and watch who reaches for a suitcase first. Nathaniel balked at the cruelty of it, actually said the word cruel out loud, pushing his chair back an inch. Vanessa just smiled, unbothered, and needled him exactly where it would land hardest. "You're afraid I'm right," she said, quiet, almost kind about it. "That's what this is. You're afraid of finding out because some part of you already knows." That single sentence did more damage than an hour of argument could have managed. He called Greg on the walk to his car, cold air biting at his collar, and told him to speed the rumor timeline up, move faster than they'd originally planned. Greg warned him more urgently than before, practically shouting into the phone from his own apartment, that real suppliers might actually pull real contracts, that this wasn't a closed loop anymore, that once it left the family, it belonged to everyone who touched it. Nathaniel promised he could handle any fallout. He didn't understand yet that some lies, once spoken aloud into the world, start hunting for a way to become true on their own, with or without anyone's permission. 2 days later, a regional business news site ran a piece reporting that Harrington Design was carrying significant hidden debt. The article never said the company was bankrupt. It didn't have to. It was enough to set off a wave of calls from banks and longtime partners within hours, phones ringing off the hook on 3 different floors of the building. Greg spent the whole day fielding calls, trying to manage the damage without confirming or denying anything specific, though a distributor out of Stuttgart pulled a major order by that evening regardless, unwilling to wait around and find out. For the first time, Nathaniel felt something close to real fear that the experiment could cost him more than he'd budgeted for, sitting alone in his office long after everyone else had gone home. Even so, when he got home that night and found Clare on the phone with Diane, fighting to keep the plant's subsidized cafeteria open through a budget freeze that had come down without warning, he decided to keep going anyway. When she hung up, she asked him for a straight answer, standing in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, not angry, just steady in a way that made the question harder to dodge than shouting would have. He held her gaze and told her the whole lie. The company was on the actual edge of collapse. She went white. She didn't run. She asked if he'd broken any laws to get them here. He said no. She crossed the kitchen and took his hand in both of hers, her grip firm. "If you haven't betrayed anyone," she said, "we can start over. Just don't abandon the people who trusted you to do right by them." Nathaniel felt something close to shame in that moment, standing there letting her hold his hand over a lie. Not quite enough to confess, not yet. Over the following days, he watched her, almost against his will, cut every expense she could find without being asked twice. She sold 2 designer dresses she'd never even worn, still with the tags on, and put the money straight into a folder marked Plant Fund that she kept in the bottom drawer of her nightstand. She connected with a legal aid group downtown to offer free job counseling to anyone at the company who wanted it, driving out to Dayton twice more on her own, without telling him exactly when. She wasn't protecting the family's image, and it was becoming impossible for him to pretend otherwise, no matter how hard Vanessa's voice in his head kept insisting there was still an angle he was missing. She was quietly, methodically building a safety net for 400 people. She mostly didn't even know by name yet. Vanessa, meanwhile, started clearing out her own apartment in the West Loop. Clothes, documents, the jewelry Nathaniel had bought her over 18 months, boxed and labeled with a precision that suggested she'd rehearsed this, and had an assistant discreetly check whether a rival firm across the river was hiring a new communications director, feeling out the market before she needed it. Greg discovered the pattern almost by accident, while auditing corporate access logs one late night, trying to reconcile a discrepancy that had nothing to do with any of this, and flagged it to Nathaniel the next morning, though all he said out loud, still protecting Vanessa more than he meant to, was that she had downloaded some sensitive files to a personal device. Nathaniel refused to believe it meant anything, insisting she was probably just gathering material to help protect the company if things got worse, the way any good communications director might. Greg looked at him for a long moment across the desk, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with watching a friend dig his own grave in slow motion. His boss demanded impossible proof from the one woman who'd never lied to him in 6 years of marriage, and handed out unlimited excuses to the one who was actively selling him out from a hotel room 20 minutes away. The morning chosen for the staged collapse dawned grey and cold off the lake, the kind of Chicago morning that makes everything look a little more like an ending than it actually is. Nathaniel had one of the last 2 cars towed from the driveway, in full view of the neighbors, cancelled the household staff for the week with a phone call that took less than 2 minutes, and had 2 attorneys he trusted personally pretend to review foreclosure paperwork at the dining room table. Briefcases open, papers spread out like evidence in a trial that wasn't real. Claire helped Dorothy and the groundskeeper, a quiet man named Ellis who'd tended the property for 11 years, pack their things into the back of Ellis's truck, pressed an extra week's pay into each of their hands out of her own account without being asked, and promised to call the second things improved, meaning every word of it. She didn't cry in front of either of them. Only once she was alone in the hallway, the front door finally shut behind Ellis's truck pulling away, did she lean her forehead against the cool plaster wall and close her eyes for a moment, just breathing. Nathaniel watched her from behind his half-open office door, close enough to hear her breathing catch once, twice. For 1 second he wanted to cross the hallway, hold her, end the entire thing right there and confess everything, tell her none of it was real, and beg her forgiveness before it went any further. Then his phone buzzed with a message from Vanessa. "I'm here. Today you'll finally know who really loves you, Lee." That confidence, so close to a taunt it barely qualified as reassurance, is exactly what pushed him to gather both women into the living room an hour later and set the fake foreclosure notice down on the table between them the moment we opened this story with. Which brings us back to where we started, the door closing behind Vanessa's ivory suitcase, Claire calmly gathering the earrings off the console to sell the next morning, Nathaniel telling her there was no rush, and Claire answering, quiet but immovable, that the workers couldn't live on promises while she took her time about it. She asked him for the keys to the financial records. He said Greg would handle all of that. She looked at him with a sadness that had nothing performative in it at all, and said that if they were going to lose the company, at the very least they should lose it without abandoning the people who'd built it with their own hands. It wasn't a romantic line, and that's exactly why it landed so hard. She wasn't staying to prove anything to him. She was staying because a crisis, real or not, revealed exactly what everyone owed each other, and she intended to pay her share of it regardless of what he chose to do with his. At the office the next morning, the rumor had already curdled into full-blown panic. Dozens of employees crowded the lobby around a tentative layoff list someone had leaked and taped to a bulletin board near the elevators, the paper already curling at the corners from being touched too many times. There were mothers crying quietly by the security desk, men on their phones with banks trying to explain why they might need a grace period, 20-somethings asking anyone who'd listen whether they'd still be paid for the month already worked. Claire climbed onto a folding chair someone dragged over from the break room, asked for quiet, and got it almost instantly, the whole lobby stilling around her. She promised no miracles. She said she didn't have all the answers yet, but that nobody in that lobby would be ignored, and that she would personally stay until every single case had been looked at, one by one, no matter how long it took. From the glass walkway above, Nathaniel watched her organize people into groups by urgency, pull the most pressing files from Diane, and have the cafeteria reopened on her dime for anyone who'd been standing there for hours with nothing to eat. He had expected to see fear in her, maybe dependence, maybe even gratitude directed at him for whatever small mercy he might offer. Instead, he saw command, calm and total, the kind that didn't need his permission to exist. Greg came up beside him with worse news, phone still in his hand. The German distributor was gone for good. A major bank wanted an emergency review of their credit line by end of week, and 3 senior executives were already threatening to resign before lunch. "This isn't a game anymore, Nate," Greg said, low enough that no one else could hear. Nathaniel didn't answer. Down below, Claire looked up through the glass, and for a moment their eyes met across 3 stories of open air. There was no accusation in her face yet. Just one quiet, unbearable question. Why won't you come down here and face this with me? By 9 that night, Claire had sorted the entire staff by urgency. Families with young kids first, people with mortgages behind on payment, workers caring for sick or aging parents, Temp employees with no severance at all, standing to lose everything overnight and nowhere to appeal to. When the cafeteria manager balked at reopening over a stack of unpaid invoices, worried about his own job if he overstepped, Claire simply handed over her own card, an account Nathaniel hadn't thought to freeze because it had always been hers alone, opened years before they'd even met. From the walkway, he watched his wife carry warm plates of food to people she'd met for the first time that day, kneeling down to talk to a little girl whose mother worked the line, letting the girl hold her watch for a minute just to see her smile. He had imagined ruin would send her running to him for protection. Instead, she seemed to have completely forgotten that she too stood to lose the only adult life she'd known for 6 years of marriage, and that forgetting looked less like naivety and more like conviction. Vanessa, for her part, checked into a hotel suite near O'Hare, close enough to the airport that she could disappear within the hour if things went sideways, the kind of room she'd booked before, always with an exit in mind. She spread confidential client contracts, upcoming campaign decks, and internal pricing sheets across the hotel bed and called an executive she knew at a rival design firm downtown, a man named Preston Hale, offering supplier lists and pricing strategy in exchange for a senior title, a signing bonus and legal cover if Harrington Design went under before the quarter closed. The diamond bracelet she'd returned at the house had been a cheap replica all along, purchased specifically for the occasion. The real one, appraised months earlier at a shop on Oak Street, sat sewn into the lining of her travel bag where no one would think to look. She felt no guilt at all about walking away from Nathaniel. Loyalty to her had always just been a word people used when they couldn't negotiate something better for themselves, a soft word for a hard transaction. When Nathaniel finally reached her by phone that night, pacing his own dark office, her voice cracked right on cue, and she told him she'd only left to keep reporters from tying her name to the scandal so she could stay useful to him from the outside, working her contacts quietly on his behalf. He didn't push. He wanted to believe she was being strategic, not cowardly, because the alternative meant admitting he'd trusted the wrong person completely, with almost everything. Past midnight, Claire and Diane pulled the most urgent employee files into an empty conference room on the 9th floor, the whole building quiet around them, except for the hum of the HVAC, and found something Claire hadn't expected. Dozens of employees had worked unpaid overtime for months on end, and at least 3 internal support programs, a childcare stipend, a transit subsidy, an emergency medical fund, had been quietly suspended without any notice sent down the chain. Claire felt anger and shame in equal measure, flipping through printout after printout. She'd spent years attending galas partly funded by the profits these same people generated with their labor, and she'd never once thought to ask where the money actually came from or where it stopped flowing. Diane admitted, hesitant, rubbing at her tired eyes, that she'd filed multiple reports over the past year, but most of them never made it past Vanessa's desk, since Vanessa controlled internal communications and decided which problems were allowed to reach Nathaniel at all, filtering everything through her own judgment of what he needed to hear. Claire proposed a temporary relief fund, funded out of her own savings, and asked Diane for a full list of non-essential expenses across the company that could be cut without touching a single paycheck, no matter how small the cut. The next morning, before the office even opened, she carried a small velvet box to a jewelry buyer on Wabash Avenue. Not just gifts from the marriage, but her late grandmother's watch, a Bulova with a cracked leather band that had survived 3 generations and 2 moves across state lines, and a thin gold necklace her mother had given her on her 28th birthday, the year before she passed. The buyer, an older man who'd clearly seen this kind of transaction before, urged her to wait, said selling under pressure like this always meant a lower price than she deserved. She asked for cash on the spot and walked out 20 minutes later with an envelope that covered 3 families' overdue medical bills and kept a makeshift food pantry running out of the 9th floor conference room for 2 straight weeks. When Nathaniel found out what she'd sold, pride and guilt hit him at almost the same instant, standing in the doorway of that conference room watching her stack canned goods with her own hands, and for the first time he seriously considered ending the lie that same afternoon, walking straight into the boardroom and telling everyone the truth. Instead, some smaller, more frightened part of him decided there was still one more test worth running, one more piece of proof he needed before he could let himself believe any of it, and he had Greg draft an internal memo warning that next month's payroll might not be fully covered. Not to actually send it, just to leave it somewhere Claire would find it on her own, as if by accident. Greg refused flatly, for the first time in 3 weeks of going along with everything, warning that a memo like that could trigger mass resignations and real lawsuits that no rumor could ever walk back once it was in writing. Nathaniel overruled him anyway, and Greg drafted it with his jaw tight the entire time, saving a copy for himself before he was done, a habit he couldn't quite explain to himself yet. Claire found the memo the next afternoon, tucked inside a folder she was reviewing for Diane between 2 unrelated reports, and instead of panicking, she sat very still at the conference table for a long moment, staring at the page, then started calculating, line by line, exactly how much the most vulnerable families would need to get through a missed paycheck without losing their housing or their health insurance. She called Nathaniel and asked him to meet her at the house that evening, her voice steady on the phone in a way that unsettled him more than tears would have. When he arrived, she had a notebook open on the coffee table full of numbers, addresses, cheaper housing listings circled in pen. A plan already 3 pages deep, she was ready to leave the mansion immediately, sell off the furniture piece by piece if it came to that, and move into a small paid-off apartment she still owned back in Cleveland from before the marriage. One she'd never once mentioned selling even when money was tight. "I don't need this house to still be your wife," she told him, and her voice didn't waver once across the whole sentence. "But I need to know that the man I married won't let 400 families go under just to save face." It was, without either of them saying it out loud, the exact moment Nathaniel realized she would have stayed through actual poverty and never once become complicit in a lie to get out of it. She made it clear, gently but without any room for negotiation, that if the company failed through bad decisions, they'd absorb the consequences together. But if it ever came out that it failed through fraud, she would not shield him from the law, not even as his wife, not even to save the both of them from public shame. That same night, a security alert on the company's server flagged an attempt by Vanessa to remotely access a confidential folder from her hotel room, time-stamped just after midnight. Greg, digging deeper out of pure instinct, unable to sleep anyway, found a file inside labeled Personal Contingency Scenario, time-stamped 9 days before the fake crisis had even officially begun. Inside was a document predicting, almost line by line, with a coldness that made his stomach turn, exactly how CH would react to a staged financial collapse. Request access to the accounts within 72 hours. Pack a bag within 48. Call a divorce attorney by the end of the week, if not sooner. Claire read her own initials on that page in a quiet corner of the 9th floor the next morning, Diane standing beside her, not saying a word, and understood, all at once, with a clarity that felt almost physical, like the floor tilting slightly beneath her, that she hadn't been protected from a crisis at all. She had been dropped into one on purpose as a test subject, and someone had written up the expected results in advance, filed away like a lab report waiting to be checked off. What followed moved fast, faster than any of them were fully ready for. Recovered audio from an old internal call, pulled from a backup server Diane's team had insisted on keeping for compliance reasons, confirmed Nathaniel's own voice, unmistakable, saying, "I don't want promises. I want to watch her lose her comforts and decide whether she still picks me." Vanessa's leaked emails, laid out on a projector screen in front of the entire board 2 days later, proved she'd been selling client data and pricing strategy to Preston Hale's firm in exchange for a job offer and a corporate apartment on Lakeshore Drive. The terms spelled out in writing with a specificity that left no room for the excuses she tried to offer. At an emergency board meeting packed with executives and worker representatives from every department, standing room only along the back wall, Greg stood up and admitted his role in the whole simulation, then handed over signed copies of every single order he'd followed, including the one Nathaniel had forced him to draft the week before, sliding the folder across the table with hands that weren't quite steady. Vanessa, cornered on every side, revealed the affair right there in front of the entire room, reading old text messages aloud from her own phone where Nathaniel had called Claire too used to money to ever really walk away. A public admission that hit harder than any spreadsheet in the room, harder than any of the financial evidence combined. The board voted, almost unanimously, one abstention, to suspend Nathaniel as CEO pending a full independent investigation, with Greg taking limited operational control under direct oversight, and Diane appointed to head a brand new worker protection committee with real authority and its own budget line. That evening, back at the house, Claire packed the same battered old suitcase she'd carried into the marriage 6 years earlier, the one that had sat gathering dust on the top shelf of her closet ever since their wedding night, when Nathaniel had laughed gently and promised she'd never need to use it again. She told Nathaniel she wasn't leaving over one single lie, but over everything that lie had exposed about how easily he could turn people into instruments to calm his own fear, how far he was willing to let that fear reach before it stopped mattering to him, whose lives it touched. She left her keys and the household cards on the entry table, walked out the front door without looking back, though she didn't take off her wedding ring on the way out, unwilling, even then, to turn the moment into another piece of theatre for anyone watching, including herself. The next morning, Nathaniel stood in front of a bank of cameras with no PR team beside him, no script prepared by anyone but himself, and admitted everything on record: the fake bankruptcy, the affair, the manipulation of hundreds of employees who'd done nothing but show up and work every single day they were asked to. He gave up his executive bonuses for 5 years, sold off company art, 2 vacation properties in Michigan, and 3 of his personal vehicles to fund a permanent worker relief program that Diane would go on to run, and started weekly therapy sessions, something he'd have called a humiliation a month earlier, and now understood as something closer to survival, the only door left that hadn't slammed shut on him. In session after session, he finally admitted out loud that he hadn't actually wanted the truth about Clare at all. He'd wanted to manufacture a single perfect moment where she chose him above absolutely everything, just to feel for once irreplaceable to somebody, the way his father had never once let him feel growing up. Vanessa lost her job within the week, faced a corporate espionage investigation that dragged on for months and eventually cost her a civil settlement she'd spent years paying off, and watched Preston Hale's offer evaporate the moment the scandal hit the local news. No firm willing to hire a communications director who'd just been caught selling out her own employer on camera in front of a room full of witnesses. Claire moved back to Cleveland and, within a year, opened a small storefront near the lake called Open Door, offering free legal and financial counseling to workers and to women trapped in relationships where someone else controlled every dollar they touched. She built it slowly, city grant by city grant, volunteer hour by volunteer hour, Diane driving up on weekends to help with intake when the caseload got too heavy, and it had nothing to do with the Harrington name by the time it opened its doors. No plaque, no ribbon-cutting photo op, just a hand-painted sign and a waiting room that stayed full. Months later, invited to speak at a business ethics forum that Clare's non-profit was co-hosting downtown, Nathaniel showed up by train, alone. No driver, no entourage, just a folder of public financial reports under his arm, and a suit he'd picked out himself for the first time in years, and told a room full of strangers that trust doesn't run on a balance sheet, no matter how good the numbers look on paper. He didn't mention Clare by name until the very end, and when he did, he said simply that the person he'd tried to test had understood the company's real obligations better than he ever had, while he, holding all the power, had treated everyone around him like pieces in an experiment. Afterward, on a walk along the river with Clare, the two of them keeping a careful, deliberate distance between them the whole way, he asked for her forgiveness without asking for anything else in return. No promises attached, no conditions, no half-hidden request folded inside the apology. She told him she still loved him. That hadn't disappeared overnight, and she wasn't going to pretend it had, wasn't going to perform indifference just to protect her own pride. But that love couldn't be the only thing deciding this anymore. She needed to know with real certainty, built over time and not over one good speech, that he would never again turn her choices into a secret evaluation he alone got to grade. They didn't get back together that day. They agreed to stay separate for now, to keep going to therapy, together sometimes and apart others, and to see each other only when they both genuinely wanted to, with no obligation attached to either side, no calendar reminder, no expectation waiting on the other end of a missed call. A year later, Harrington Design was smaller than it had been at its peak, but steadier, every executive bonus now tied directly to verified worker conditions instead of quarterly stock performance, a policy Diane had fought the board for line by line until it finally passed. Greg stayed on as CFO under an outside auditor's permanent oversight and made a point every single quarter of sitting down personally with the Worker Protection Committee before any numbers went to the board. A habit born less out of obligation now than out of something closer to penance he'd chosen for himself. Claire still keeps her grandmother's watch on her wrist every single day. The leather band replaced but the face untouched, and that old suitcase still sits in the corner of her closet in Cleveland, not as a symbol of running away anymore, but as quiet proof to herself that she can always leave any place and any person the moment she stops being respected there, and that the choice, this time and every time after, would always be entirely her own. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved us putting it together, that's exactly the kind of storytelling this channel was built for. So hit that like button, drop a comment telling us which moment hit you the hardest, and subscribe so you never miss the next one.